Welcome back to the Alibi Club, where every mystery is a case file waiting to be reopened. They found her in the ice, a woman with no name, no past, and no future, burned almost beyond recognition, lying in a lonely valley known grimly as Death Valley. Around her, strange objects scattered, coded notes, wigs, bottles, stripped of fingerprints, and clues that whispered of espionage. Who was she? A spy caught in a deadly game, a victim of murder, or something even stranger, a life erased before it could ever be understood? This is not just a case. This is a riddle carved into cold stone. On November 29, 1970, hikers in the Isdalen Valley near Bergen, Norway, stumbled upon a scene that would haunt investigators for decades. Lying on a slope of blackened rock was the body of a woman, badly burned, her clothes charred, her features destroyed by fire. Nearby, strange items lay scattered, bottles without labels, an umbrella, a watch with its serial number scratched off, and a series of belongings that seemed chosen not for their usefulness, but for their silence. Even stranger were the details uncovered later: multiple passports under different names, hotel registries filled with false addresses, and the odd discovery of wigs and disguises. The Norwegian police quickly realized this was no ordinary death. The woman's fingerprints had been deliberately sanded away, her possessions scrubbed of identity. Autopsy reports revealed a cocktail of sleeping pills and carbon monoxide in her system, alongside smoke in her lungs, proof she was alive as the flames consumed her. Suicide, some claimed, but others saw something colder, the hallmarks of an execution, a silenced agent in the shadowy world of the Cold War. To this day, the Isdal Woman remains nameless, her case unresolved. Tonight we reopen her file, not to solve it, but to walk the trail of her mystery, from the burned valley to the coded notebooks, from whispers of espionage to the haunting silence she left behind. The story of the Isdal Woman begins not just in the cold valley where her body was found, but in the shadows of a Europe still locked in the iron grip of the Cold War. To understand the mystery, you must first step into Norway in the late 1960s and early 1970s, a place that seemed peaceful on the surface, but was far from untouched by the turbulence of its era. Norway, perched on the northern edge of Europe, was a quiet stage with loud secrets. Its fjords and mountains were postcard perfect, but its geography made it strategically vital. The Soviet Union loomed to the east, NATO's Arctic defenses stretched across the region, and in the waters off Norway's coast, submarine traffic and intelligence operations danced an invisible war. Bergen itself, the picturesque city near where the woman was found, was home to military installations, naval activity, and a watchful eye on the seas. To most, Norway was a safe corner of Europe. To those in the world of espionage, it was a chessboard. This is the stage into which the nameless woman stepped. What little we know of her life comes not from testimony, but from fragments, objects that spoke more loudly in their strangeness than in their silence. Before her death, she traveled across Norway and Europe under at least 9 false identities. She checked into hotels using different names, sometimes claiming to be Belgian, other times German. She carried wigs, elegant clothing, and cosmetics. In her luggage, police later found coded notations, sequences of letters and numbers that, when examined, matched the dates and locations of her travels. Her handwriting was elegant, her demeanor described as reserved, sometimes wary, sometimes strangely glamorous. She seemed always to be on the move, always under a mask. Norwegian police would later piece together her wanderings like shards of a broken mirror. Witnesses recalled her appearing in Bergen before her death, speaking with a heavy foreign accent, sometimes in German, sometimes in broken English. She seemed well-educated, intelligent, but distant. Hotel staff remembered her swapping rooms, paying in cash, and at times refusing to allow cleaning staff inside. One shopkeeper recalled her purchasing a rubber boot, an odd choice, given the elegance of her other attire. Each piece of testimony added to the picture, but also blurred it. She seemed to exist only in fragments, like a shadow slipping between disguises. The discovery of her body pulled all of this into a chilling context. On November 29, 1970, in a valley already known as Death Valley, due to earlier suicides and accidents, hikers stumbled upon a horrific scene. The woman lay on her back, her front badly burned, her belongings charred around her, a half-empty bottle of sleeping pills, an empty liquor bottle, and traces of petrol were nearby. Her jewelry was laid neatly beside her body, not worn. To investigators, it looked staged, arranged. The autopsy revealed she had ingested 50 to 70 sleeping pills, and yet there was smoke in her lungs. She had been alive as the fire consumed her. But the background of her case extends beyond her death, into the machinery of investigation itself. Police soon discovered that her fingerprints had been filed down. Labels had been cut from her clothing. Her suitcases, recovered from a Bergen train station, were filled with wigs, cosmetics and passports, all false. Among her belongings were receipts that traced her across Europe: Paris, Hamburg, Rome, Oslo. She had lived a life of constant travel, and yet no one could say who she really was. This is what makes the background of the Isdal Woman so vital. It is a case that lives in the liminal space between worlds. On one side, the ordinary tragedies of suicide and despair. On the other, the chilling precision of espionage. Norway in 1970 was not just a quiet northern country. It was a front line in the shadow war of spies. Soviet and NATO operatives moved through its ports. Shadowed submarines prowled its coasts, and whispers of intelligence operations traveled through its cities like ghosts. To this day, many believe the Isdal Woman was one of them. A courier, a spy, perhaps even a double agent caught in a dangerous game. Others argue she was simply a woman with secrets, caught in the jaws of paranoia and despair. Either way, her background, or the absence of it, has become the mystery itself. Her presence was fleeting, her traces carefully erased, but the context of her world was alive with tension. A woman with no past, discovered in a valley of death, in a country balancing between East and West. It is here, in this backdrop of Cold War unease and shadows of espionage, that the case file of the Isdal Woman begins. The late afternoon of November 29th, 1970, in Bergen, Norway, was cold and grey, the kind of winter light that fades too quickly into night. In the Isdalen Valley, a steep rugged gorge on the edge of the city, hikers trudged along a trail often used by locals. Despite its grim nickname Death Valley, the name came from its history. Over the years, climbers had fallen, hikers had met accidents, and suicides had stained the valley's reputation. It was not a place for comfort, it was a place for endings. That day, two hikers, father and daughters, noticed a strange smell drifting on the wind. It was not the earthy scent of damp moss or pine. It was acrid, heavy, unmistakable, the smell of burning. As they followed the source, their eyes caught a sight that froze them mid-step. There, on a rocky slope, lay the charred remains of a woman. She was on her back, her body partially burned, her arms twisted upward as though in a final act of protest or surrender. The ground around her was blackened, the grass scorched. A strange collection of items surrounded her: an umbrella, pieces of clothing, a bottle that had once contained liquor, and another that had once held sleeping pills. The acrid smoke still clung to the rocks, as if the fire had only just died. The hikers reported their discovery, and soon police officers, investigators, and journalists descended on the scene. Flashbulbs captured what words struggled to describe: a body badly burned, yet surrounded by objects that seemed deliberately placed. Most chilling was the jewelry. Instead of being melted onto her body, it was neatly laid out beside her: a watch, earrings and rings, stripped from her hands and wrists. It looked ritualistic, staged, as though someone wanted the scene to tell a story, or hide one. The investigators worked through the night, under the dim beam of lanterns. They noted details quickly, before the dark swallowed the valley whole. The woman's face was unrecognizable, her hair singed away, her clothes blackened, and yet certain clues stood out. Her shoes, for example, were only partially burned, suggesting she had not been engulfed in flames all at once. Her belongings bore signs of deliberate tampering. Bottles had labels removed. Items were scrubbed of identifying marks. The immediate question was obvious: suicide or murder? The bottle suggested a deliberate overdose. The woman had clearly ingested a large number of sleeping pills, 50 to 70 by some counts. The liquor too suggested a self-inflicted escape, but the fire told another story. The autopsy would later reveal that smoke was present in her lungs. She had still been breathing when the fire consumed her, and the jewelry, so carefully removed and placed beside her, seemed less like the actions of a despairing woman, and more like the signature of someone arranging a stage. In the cold silence of that night, the investigators began to sense that this was not just a death, but a performance. As news spread through Bergen, the discovery sent a shiver across the city. This was no ordinary tragedy. Rumors swirled almost immediately. Some claimed she was a foreigner. Others whispered of espionage. Bergen, after all, was no stranger to secrets. NATO installations dotted the region. Naval activity pulsed through its fjords. To those who lived there, it was easy to imagine that a woman found burned in Death Valley might not have been an accident at all, but the fallout of something larger. When her body was transported to the morgue, the strangeness deepened. Her fingerprints were sanded away, smooth where identity should have been. Her dental work suggested foreign origins, fillings not common in Norway. Her suitcases, discovered later in a Bergen train station, were filled with wigs, disguises, cosmetics, and false passports. Notes in code matched the dates and cities of her travels. She had moved across Europe like a shadow, never staying long, never staying still. But on the night of November 29th, before all those discoveries came to light, investigators faced a valley filled with contradictions. The body of a woman consumed by fire, yet alive when the flames touched her. Jewelry removed, as though to make her anonymous, or to honor her in some strange ritual. Bottles of pills and liquor that suggested a choice, and yet an arrangement that suggested a hand other than her own. By morning, as frost settled over the valley, the crime scene was already slipping into legend. Photographs would later become infamous. Black and white images of the burned figure, the strange scattering of objects, the eerie silence of Death Valley. Each picture told a story, but not the same story. To some it was suicide, a woman alone, tired and desperate, erasing herself in the only way she knew. To others, it was murder, a carefully staged execution, the work of hands determined to hide her true identity. And beneath both of those possibilities was the whisper of something stranger. The Cold War context made every oddity feel heavier. Who files down their fingerprints, unless they have reason to hide? Who carries wigs and false passports, unless they need to vanish and reappear? Who dies in a valley known for death, in a country caught between East and West, without leaving behind even a name? The night of November 29th did not answer these questions. It only gave birth to them. The Isdal Woman entered history not with an identity, but with a puzzle laid out in fire, in silence, in a valley where the air itself seemed to carry secrets. That was the night the mystery began, and from that night forward, every step of the investigation would only deepen the fog. When we look into a case file, it's easy to see the victim as just evidence, a body, a crime scene, a collection of objects catalogued and photographed. But behind the burned remains found in Isdalen Valley was a human being, a woman who breathed, traveled, spoke, laughed perhaps, and carried secrets heavier than the luggage she left behind. If the mystery of the Isdalen Woman endures, it's because she was not just a body in the forest. She was a presence, glimpsed fleetingly by strangers, remembered in fragments, reconstructed through shadows. Investigators gave her the name she could not give herself, the Isdal Woman. Without it, she was nameless. Her fingerprints had been sanded away, her possessions stripped of labels, her trail carefully obscured. But the fragments that survived offer enough to sketch a portrait, not a complete one, but one that flickers like an image half-developed on film. She was described as striking. Witnesses who saw her in hotels recalled an elegant woman, well-dressed, sometimes glamorous, sometimes practical, depending on which identity she wore. She had dark hair, often concealed under wigs, blonde, brunette, sometimes styled differently from one city to the next. Her age was estimated between 25 and 40. Her teeth bore dental work not common in Norway, suggesting origins elsewhere, possibly Central or Southern Europe. Her handwriting in hotel registries was neat, deliberate, practiced. She paid in cash, never credit. She seemed to prefer solitude, but when she did speak, it was with a noticeable accent that shifted between German and French tones, and at times broken English. 9 false identities are known to have been used by her across Europe. 9 names that belonged to no real person. In some, she was Belgian. In others, German. Each identity carried with it false addresses, false details, threads that unraveled under even the lightest tug. And yet, she moved through border crossings and hotel lobbies with them, never raising enough suspicion to be stopped. Whoever she was, she understood the art of disguise, not the theatrical kind, but the subtle camouflage of someone who wanted to be invisible in plain sight. Her belongings, discovered in 2 suitcases at Bergen train station, painted a strange picture: wigs, cosmetics, maps, clothing from multiple countries, and the most puzzling item of all, coded notes. When deciphered, the codes matched travel dates and city initials, a system to track her movements. It wasn't the language of an amateur tourist, it was the ledger of someone who needed precision, someone who could not afford to be careless. And yet, despite the careful disguises, she left impressions on those who met her. Hotel staff remembered her as mysterious, even unsettling. She often changed rooms without explanation. She sometimes requested meals brought to her room, then refused entry to staff. At other times, she seemed animated, even radiant, dining in the hotel restaurant, dressed elegantly, her presence commanding attention. One witness described her as a woman who looked as if she belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. Even strangers outside the hotels recalled her. A local Bergen shopkeeper remembered her purchasing rubber boots, oddly practical against the otherwise stylish wardrobe she carried. Others described seeing her with unidentified men, often foreign-looking, in cafes or public spaces. These meetings were never documented, never traced. Were they casual encounters or the shadows of something deeper? Spies, contacts, handlers, no one could say. But the woman seemed never to be entirely alone, even when she traveled by herself. Autopsy reports added more layers to the portrait. She had eaten shortly before her death, a last meal of tablets and alcohol. She had a high concentration of sleeping pills in her stomach. Her lungs contained soot, meaning she was alive while the fire consumed her. This was not a clean, clinical ending. It was violent, chaotic, terrifying. If it was suicide, it was a gruesome one. If it was murder, it was meant to erase her completely. Yet for all these details, the most haunting part of her humanity is the silence that followed her. No family came forward to claim her body. No missing persons report matched her description. No government acknowledged her existence. She was buried in Bergen, her grave marked simply with flowers placed by strangers who refused to let her memory vanish. A Catholic priest conducted the ceremony, though no one knew her faith. She lies in Millendal Cemetery, her resting place a quiet question carved in stone. The attempts to humanize her did not stop there. Artists reconstructed her face from skeletal remains, producing images shown in newspapers across Europe. Some people believed they recognized her. Calls poured in claiming she resembled a friend, a neighbor, a co-worker, but each lead withered. Her reconstructed face became like her disguises, familiar but elusive. There were small, strange human details too, tucked into the case file like whispers. She carried silver spoons in her luggage. She smoked, heavily. Her choice of perfume was strong, noticeable. She bought postcards from the cities she visited, though she never sent them. She wore makeup carefully, suggesting not vanity, but a kind of armor. Each of these details speaks of a woman living in fragments, never whole, never still. And yet, if we step back, what do we really know? A woman, well-traveled, multilingual, elegant, cautious. A woman who erased her fingerprints, carried wigs, lived under false names. A woman who died in fire, her jewelry placed beside her as though her identity had been stripped away piece by piece. Her humanity lies not just in these fragments, but in the unanswered questions they leave. Did she laugh with friends in Paris? Did she cry alone in a hotel room in Hamburg? Did she write letters she could never send? Was she proud of the life she lived? Or was it a burden? Was she a spy, hardened and trained? Or a woman caught in something she could not escape? The tragedy of the Isdal Woman is not only that she died violently, it is that she died nameless. Her story reduced to coded notes and fragments of disguise. To humanize her is to acknowledge that behind the wigs and false passports was a person, someone with fears, choices, and perhaps regrets. And so, when we revisit her case, we are not just reopening a file, we are trying piece by piece to give her back what was taken, a sense of self, to remember that before she was the Isdal Woman, she was someone's daughter, perhaps someone's friend, someone who walked through cities lit with neon and snow, someone who carried secrets that no one has yet untangled. This is the victim at the heart of the mystery. Not a spy, not a ghost, but a human being erased before she could ever be understood. When the Isdal Woman's case file is spread open, it's not just the discovery of her body that unsettles you. It's the trail of strangeness that came before, the peculiar movements, the deliberate erasures, the odd behavior in public spaces that suggested she knew, or feared, that someone was watching her. If the valley was the end, then these clues were the tremors before the collapse, the whispers that hinted at danger before it arrived. Begin with her identities. At least 9 false passports were traced back to her movements across Europe. Each one carried a different name, a different nationality, Belgian, German, sometimes claiming to be from a small town that didn't exist. sometimes from an address that unraveled under investigation. They weren't sophisticated forgeries in the modern sense, but in 1970, they were convincing enough to pass through hotels and border checks. The names became a carousel of masks. She was never one person for long. That in itself was a clue. Who needs so many identities, if not someone playing a dangerous game? Her travels, pieced together from hotel records, formed a map of restlessness. She was in Paris, Hamburg, Oslo, Stavanger, Trondheim, and Bergen. In each place, she stayed only briefly, moving like a shadow from one room to the next. Witnesses described her as polite but distant, a woman who paid in cash, kept to herself, and often insisted that hotel staff not clean her room. In one hotel, she asked for a balcony overlooking the street, a vantage point more fitting for surveillance than relaxation. In another, she dined alone, but was seen meeting with unknown men. Always foreign, always difficult to trace. Each city was another step in a journey no one could fully reconstruct. Among her belongings were coded notes, numbers and letters scrawled in what at first appeared to be nonsense. When cracked, they lined up with her travel dates and destinations. She was recording her own movements in code, as though keeping track not for memory but for precision. For investigators, it was an unmistakable mark of espionage. Tourists don't code their travel itineraries. Operatives do. There were also the wigs, multiple wigs, each styled differently, found in her suitcases. They weren't the playful kind, not costumes for a party. They were practical, designed to change her appearance subtly, to shift her identity just enough from city to city. Witnesses sometimes described her as blonde, other times brunette. In truth, she was both, and neither. The wigs made her forgettable, a ghost who could pass unnoticed. And yet, their very presence in her luggage was a glaring clue. This was a woman who lived her life in disguise. Then there were her odd purchases. One shopkeeper remembered her buying a rubber boot, a practical item that stood out against her otherwise stylish wardrobe. Another recalled her buying expensive cosmetics, the kind of items used to maintain appearances on the move. In her luggage, police found silver spoons ordinary, except for the fact that the monograms had been filed away. It was the same pattern repeated again and again. Every detail of her possessions was carefully stripped of identity, scrubbed of origin. Clothes had their tags cut out, bottles had their labels removed. Even her shoes bore signs of deliberate erasure. Each object was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in function, extraordinary in its silence. Her behavior was strange too, especially in Bergen, in the days leading up to her death. Witnesses recalled seeing her walking briskly through the city, looking over her shoulder, as if paranoid. In one account she appeared with two men, speaking in a language that wasn't Norwegian. In another, she seemed nervous, even frightened, glancing around constantly, as though expecting to be followed. A hotel clerk remembered her staring out the window for long stretches, smoking cigarette after cigarette. To those who saw her, she seemed less like a tourist enjoying Norway's beauty and more like someone cornered by unseen pressures. Some of the strangest clues came from her meals. She often ordered simple dishes, sometimes insisting on privacy while she ate. In one instance, she complained of stomach pain, perhaps from stress or from the pills she was already consuming. Traces of medication were later found in her system, long before the final overdose. It raised a troubling possibility. Was she already trying to numb herself, or was someone else gradually preparing her end? Police also uncovered a peculiar witness report from a man who claimed to have encountered her on a mountain hike outside Bergen. According to him, she was dressed elegantly, far too elegantly for the rugged trail, and seemed utterly out of place. She appeared exhausted, even disoriented, and when he tried to speak with her, she brushed him off, continuing alone into the mist. It was one of the last confirmed sightings before her death. For some, it was a sign she was already spiraling towards suicide. For others, it suggested she was being driven somewhere, either by fear or by a handler who demanded she be there. Even the location of her death, the Isdalen Valley, feels like a clue. It was isolated, eerie, already marked by tragedy. Locals called it Death Valley, not by chance, but by history. To end there was either fate or design. Did she choose it herself, seeking anonymity in a place known for it, or was she brought there, led or forced into its shadows by someone who knew she would never return? Then there are the pills. The autopsy revealed she had ingested 50 to 70 sleeping pills before the fire. Yet, this raises its own contradictions. How could someone who had consumed such a dose still be conscious enough to arrange jewelry neatly, to light a fire that consumed her body? Was it suicide performed with ritualistic care, or was it a scene staged by another, after she was already incapacitated? Every strange clue in her file sits uneasily between two possibilities: a woman meticulously preparing to erase herself, or a victim carefully erased by others. The wigs, the passports, the notes, the filed-down fingerprints, were they signs of her agency, or signs of her exploitation? Even today, these details refuse to align. They feel less like breadcrumbs leading to an answer, and more like fragments of a puzzle designed never to be complete. Each one whispers of secrets, but none of them shout the truth. What's undeniable is that the Isdal woman's life, however long it was lived, carried the weight of something extraordinary. Ordinary tourists don't erase themselves piece by piece. Ordinary lives don't end in fire, in a valley already known for death, with every clue pointing towards silence. The strange clues before her death don't close the case. They pry it open. They suggest that her final moments were not sudden chaos, but the climax of a life already steeped in shadows. Whether she was running from enemies, obeying handlers, or struggling with her own despair, she lived under the constant burden of secrecy, and secrecy leaves traces, even when identity is erased. The file marks these fragments not as answers, but as warnings. She was already in danger long before the fire lit the valley. The question is, danger from whom? From herself, or from the invisible hands that seemed always one step behind her? The Isdal woman's final days did not unfold with the quiet inevitability of despair. They unfolded like a stage play where the script kept changing, where every scene contained something suspicious, something that didn't quite fit. If her life was a riddle, then the days leading to her death were the lines written in invisible ink, visible enough to unsettle, never enough to explain. Start with the hotels. Records show she checked into multiple hotels around Bergen, using false names in the days before her body was found. In one, she introduced herself as Fenella Lorch. In another, Claudia Tealt. At each, she left a false address, paid in cash, and carried with her an aura of caution. Staff noticed she sometimes switched rooms without warning, as though uncomfortable with where she had been placed. She often covered the peephole with tape. She requested privacy, refusing entry to cleaners. These behaviors could suggest paranoia, or the careful training of someone accustomed to being watched. Witnesses recalled seeing her with men who were never identified. Some claimed they looked foreign, not Norwegian. One witness thought they saw her dining with a tall man who appeared military. Another swore she spoke in German to a companion at a restaurant. None of these men were ever traced. None came forward. Who were they? Associates? Handlers? Shadows who knew her story better than anyone. Their absence in the investigation feels suspicious in itself. Then there was her behavior. Hotel staff described her as nervous, chain-smoking, and often staring out windows for long stretches. Some said she seemed frightened, constantly glancing over her shoulder as if expecting pursuit. Yet others said she appeared glamorous, self-possessed, and even radiant when she entered the dining room, dressed elegantly and alone. These contradictions only deepen the mystery. Was she a woman unraveling, or a woman playing roles, shifting masks depending on who might be watching? The coded notes found in her luggage were another suspicious detail. They documented her travels with eerie precision, but they were written in a style that seemed designed for no one else's eyes. To some, it proved espionage, a field report disguised as a personal system. To others, it was just a nervous traveler's obsessive way of keeping track. But here is the troubling fact: she didn't need to code them for herself. Codes are used to protect information from others. Who did she think might find those notes? Who did she fear would read them? And then, there was the autopsy. The findings are among the most unsettling in the file. She had ingested between 50 and 70 sleeping pills, enough to render anyone unconscious. And yet, her lungs contained soot. She was breathing when the fire consumed her body. This detail has divided the case ever since. Could a woman that heavily sedated have arranged her jewelry neatly beside her, lit a fire, and lain down to die? Or does this point to someone else? Someone who forced her into that valley, drugged her, arranged the scene, and lit the fire while she was too weak to resist. The pills suggest suicide. The soot suggests murder. Together, they form a contradiction so sharp, it cuts every theory in two. Her jewelry itself raises further suspicion. Rings, earrings, a watch, laid carefully on the ground, not left to melt onto her body. This could have been her last act, an effort to strip herself of identity before the flames erased her face. But it could just as easily have been staged, arranged by another hand to mislead investigators. Was it ritualistic, symbolic, or simply practical? The file offers no answer, only silence. Her clothing, too, carried contradictions. Much of it had been doused with petrol, accelerating the fire, but some garments were left untouched, folded nearby. Why? If she intended to burn herself completely, why leave pieces intact? And if someone else staged the fire, why burn her body incompletely, leaving evidence behind? A true executioner would have made her unrecognizable beyond any doubt. Yet her body, though burned, still offered enough for an autopsy. It was as if the fire was both thorough and careless, purposeful and incomplete. One of the strangest suspicious events came from her luggage. When police opened her suitcases at Bergen station, they discovered a prescription for eczema cream. The doctor's name had been deliberately scraped away, yet investigators eventually traced it back to a doctor in an Italian town. How had she come there? Why erase his name, if not to sever a tie? The mere act of scraping away a doctor's identity points to someone determined to leave no trail, no connections. And yet the erasure was imperfect. It left just enough for investigators to trace it back. Was this sloppy work or a breadcrumb left deliberately? Another detail often overlooked: the presence of 12 sleeping pill wrappers in her luggage, separate from the ones she consumed before her death. She had been carrying medication with her for weeks, perhaps months. Was she preparing herself for an end long before the valley? Or were the pills part of her routine, a tool for travel, for control, for manipulation by someone else? And what of the men who followed her? Multiple witnesses claimed she was being watched in Bergen. One woman staying at her hotel remembered a group of men in the lobby, staring at her each time she passed. They never interacted, never approached, but they were always there. Police could not identify them. Spies? Journalists? Or just figments of paranoia magnified by hindsight? Suspicious either way. The contradictions in her final days create a timeline that resists coherence. She was frightened, but also composed. She was suicidal, but also methodical. She was alone, but also accompanied. She was careful to erase herself, but careless enough to leave fragments behind. Each detail could point to suicide, or murder, or espionage, or something stranger. Taken together, they collapse into fog. The most suspicious event, though, may not be in the valley itself, but in what came after. The speed with which investigators leaned towards suicide raised questions. They had before them a woman with 9 false identities, erased fingerprints, wigs, coded notes, and a death scene that screamed of staging. And yet, the official line leaned heavily on self-inflicted death. Was this bureaucratic laziness, or pressure from above to avoid acknowledging the darker possibility that this was the silencing of a spy, a death tangled in international politics? The truth is, every event around her death drips with contradiction. The pills, the soot, the jewelry, the fire, the erased fingerprints, the wigs. Each clue can be read 2 ways. Each detail carries 2 faces. It is the paradox of the case. Everything fits, and nothing fits. The file marks this section with a single conclusion. Her death was not simple. Whether she chose it or it was forced upon her, it was surrounded by shadows. Shadows of surveillance, of espionage, of fear, of erasure. Suspicious events don't solve the case. They deepen it. And so, the next page of the file opens to the aftermath, the investigation that followed, the theories that spiraled, and the failures that left her nameless. When the smoke of the Isdalen fire settled into the cold November air, what remained was a body that refused to yield answers. Yet the machinery of investigation churned forward, as it always does, files opened, evidence bagged, questions scribbled into notebooks. But if the early hours of a case set its trajectory, then the Isdalen woman was doomed from the start. Her story was destined to remain tangled, because the investigation itself seemed uncertain, almost willfully incomplete. The Bergen police took the lead. At first, the case was treated as a possible suicide. The pills, the fire, the jewelry neatly placed beside her. It all lent itself to a tidy narrative, one investigators could close quickly without international entanglements. But reality bled through in stubborn ways. False passports, wigs, coded notes, erased fingerprints, none of these belonged to a simple suicide. Still, that first theory clung to the case like smoke to clothing, shaping the investigation even as contradictory evidence piled up. Officers began by canvassing local hotels, and here they struck gold, or perhaps quicksand. Multiple concierges, waitresses, and chambermaids came forward to say they had seen the woman. Her face was unforgettable, even in life, striking, dark-haired with eyes that carried both elegance and exhaustion. They remembered her arriving with multiple suitcases, dressing sharply, dining alone but never inconspicuously. Each hotel had its own false name written on the registry, each address a fabrication: Genevieve Lancia, Alexia Zana, Claudia Tealt. The names shifted, but the face remained. It was here that police realized they weren't investigating just a death, they were chasing a ghost with 9 identities. Interpol was contacted, but no matches came back. Fingerprints, what little could be recovered, led nowhere. Dental records were analyzed against international databases, yielding nothing. She was a woman without a past, without a nation, without a family who claimed her. In an age before digital databases, before global surveillance grids, this absence was possible. And yet, even in the 1970s, it was suspicious. Someone had worked to erase her trail long before she entered that valley. The suitcases at Bergen's railway station added another strange dimension. Police pried them open expecting answers, but what they found instead was more riddles. Clothing with all labels removed, a notebook filled with cryptic numbers that decoded into travel itineraries, wigs, makeup, sunglasses, the scraped prescription label, pointing weakly toward Italy. A curious mix of everyday possessions and carefully concealed fragments of identity. Each item could have been the artifact of a nervous traveler, or a seasoned operative who lived out of disguises. Norwegian intelligence services began to hover at the edges of the case. This was the Cold War, and Norway was not a quiet corner. NATO had military exercises in the region. The Soviet Union had spies in every major European port. Bergen, a city of shipping lanes and international traffic, was hardly immune. Though not publicly acknowledged at the time, rumors circulated that the Isdal Woman had been seen near military installations. Witnesses reported spotting her watching troop movements, scribbling notes, or simply lingering in areas where tourists seldom wandered. If true, these sightings transformed her from tragic mystery into something far more dangerous, a casualty of espionage. The autopsy raised still more questions. Forensic pathologists catalogued her burns, her pill ingestion, the soot in her lungs. The official line leaned toward a bizarre suicide, but privately, investigators debated the contradictions. The level of carboxyhemoglobin in her blood indicated she had inhaled smoke. She was alive in the fire. The pills alone should have incapacitated her. The combination suggested either an elaborate staged suicide or an even more elaborate homicide. But homicide required a perpetrator, and there was none to be found. Investigators did their best to trace her movements across Europe. They managed to sketch a map: Paris, Hamburg, Geneva, Oslo, Stavanger, and Bergen. Witnesses described her speaking multiple languages: French, German, Flemish, English. Some said she spoke them fluently, others with an accent difficult to place. One man in Stavanger recalled her asking detailed questions about the movements of local shipping companies. Another in Bergen remembered her purchasing boots with unusual urgency. Everywhere she went, she left impressions, fragments, but never roots. Despite the intrigue, official communication from the Norwegian police downplayed the espionage angle. Press releases emphasized the likelihood of suicide. The alternative, that a woman had been murdered on Norwegian soil, possibly by foreign intelligence agencies, was an implication too heavy for the authorities to publicly shoulder. Better to label her a troubled drifter, a lost traveler, than to admit that spies might be moving undetected through their towns and forests. And yet, whispers persisted. Some investigators privately admitted their discomfort with the suicide theory. They pointed to the jewelry arranged with ritual precision, the missing fingerprints, the wigs, the coded notes. People who intend to kill themselves, one detective reportedly remarked, don't erase themselves so completely first. It was as if she had been preparing for disappearance, not self-destruction. The press picked up the story, and soon the Isdal Woman's face was everywhere in Norway. Composite sketches circulated, drawn from witness descriptions. Still, no family came forward, no friends recognized her, not a single embassy, not a single foreign police department admitted to missing her. Silence can sometimes be the loudest answer, and in this case, it screamed. The investigation trudged on, but leads grew thin. One hotel receptionist remembered her asking for hot porridge late at night. A taxi driver swore he'd driven her into the hills days before the body was found. Another guest recalled overhearing her speaking in a dialect of German that suggested an East German background. Each detail seemed promising, but each led nowhere. Eventually the investigation ground to its weary halt. The case was filed under unsolved with suicide as the official leaning, but doubts hung in the margins. The woman was buried in Bergen, her coffin lined with zinc, so her body could one day be repatriated if her family came forward. No one did. At her funeral, a small group of police officers stood in silence. A priest spoke generic words over an anonymous coffin. Beneath the soil lay not just a woman, but a question mark large enough to haunt decades. For many, the failures of the investigation remain the most suspicious part of all. The speed with which suicide was favored, the reluctance to probe espionage ties, the unanswered questions about the men she was seen with. Was this incompetence, or was it deliberate? Was the investigation truly a search for truth, or a careful shaping of narrative to keep the Cold War's shadows out of public view? The file as it stands is less a conclusion than a collection of failures, half-pursued leads, and uncomfortable silences. It tells us as much about what investigators chose not to do, as it does about what they did. And so, as we close this section of the file, one thing is certain: the Isdal woman was not forgotten by the investigators. She was buried by them, in paperwork, in politics, and in silence. The next section of the file leads us to the wild tangle of speculation that grew in the years after her death, the theories that sought to give her identity, motive, and meaning. Every case file eventually reaches the point where the evidence stops speaking, and speculation begins to fill the silence. The Isdal woman is no exception. In fact, it is one of those rare cases where speculation became the lifeblood of the mystery. The facts were scarce, contradictory, and unsettling. But the theories, they multiplied like shadows in candlelight. Each one had its believers, each one had its holes, and each one revealed more about the world of 1970 than about the woman herself. The first and simplest theory, the one favored by police, was suicide. According to this view, the woman was a traveler haunted by her own demons. Perhaps she was tired of running, tired of living under false names, tired of whatever secret burden weighed her down. The pills in her stomach, the soot in her lungs, the carefully placed jewelry, these could all be signs of a woman staging her own dramatic exit. Maybe she wanted to burn away completely, leaving nothing behind but mystery. It was clean, bureaucratically satisfying, and it allowed the authorities to close the file without rattling NATO or the Soviets. But the cracks in this explanation appear almost immediately. If she truly intended suicide, why erase her fingerprints? Why carry wigs and disguises across Europe? Why use false passports at every hotel? Why purchase sleeping pills in such large quantities, and then combine them with a method so agonizing and uncertain as self-immolation? And why, above all, had no one, no family, no embassy, ever claimed her body? Suicide alone may explain her death, but it does not explain her life. The second theory reaches into darker corners. Homicide. In this scenario, the Isdal woman was murdered, and her death disguised to look like suicide. The jewelry placed neatly by her side, the half-burned body, the pills, it was all a staging, a clumsy attempt to tell a story investigators would accept. Her killers, whoever they were, didn't just want her dead, they wanted her erased. Wigs, false identities, coded notebooks. These may not have been hers alone, they may have been planted, or stripped of identifying features, to ensure she vanished into anonymity. Homicide theory branches off into several sub-theories. One suggests that she was the victim of a spurned lover or criminal associate. Witnesses claim she was seen with men in Bergen, sometimes well-dressed, sometimes military in bearing. Perhaps she crossed the wrong man, perhaps she became inconvenient to the wrong group. A meeting in the forest could have turned violent, and the fire was the brutal cover-up. But most who believe in homicide lean toward espionage. The 1970s were thick with Cold War intrigue, and Norway, though often overlooked, sat at the edge of NATO's northern flank. Bergen was a hub of military and maritime activity, a staging ground for submarine movements in the North Atlantic. The Isdal woman, with her polyglot speech, her European travels, her coded notes, and her habit of staying near strategic locations, fits the profile of a spy more closely than she does a drifter. Some say she was working for the Soviets, gathering intelligence on NATO naval exercises. Others insist she may have been a double agent, working between East and West, her multiple identities, a symptom of her dangerous balancing act. If she was a spy, her death begins to look less like an accident and more like an execution. Burned bodies, false suicides, erased identities. These are common signatures in the world of espionage. And yet, if she was a spy, her handlers left her astonishingly exposed. No one claimed her. No one moved to retrieve her body, her belongings, or even her reputation. In most cases, even spies who die in the field are quietly extracted, their bodies repatriated, their stories silenced. The Isdal woman, however, was left hanging in public view, her mystery preserved. Could it be that her death was not the result of espionage, but a warning to others, a public demonstration of what happens when an operative betrays her masters? If so, it was a chillingly effective message. Another theory, more outlandish but persistent, suggests that she was part of a criminal network unrelated to espionage. The wigs, false passports and cash transactions could have marked her as a courier, smuggling contraband, art, or even weapons across borders. Europe in the 1970s was teeming with underground markets, and Norway's shipping routes were convenient channels for illicit trade. If she stumbled into betrayal or failed a delivery, perhaps she paid with her life. Then there are the stranger theories, the ones that sprout when conventional explanations fail. Some imagine she was a political dissident, fleeing a regime that eventually caught up with her. Others hint at cults or secret societies, pointing to the ritual-like arrangement of her belongings and the eerily anonymous burial. A few even dip into the paranormal, though such theories say more about the human hunger for answers than about the evidence itself. What unites all these theories is not their plausibility, but their necessity. They exist because the facts are insufficient. Each one tries to weave coherence out of scattered fragments: a coded notebook, a suitcase with labels torn away, a woman who spoke many tongues but belonged to no nation. Each theory projects meaning onto silence. The suicide theory is tidy, but unsatisfying. The homicide theory is logical, but incomplete. The espionage theory is thrilling, but unproven. The criminal courier theory is possible, but speculative. And the stranger theories, while compelling in their creativity, rely more on imagination than evidence. The truth may be buried in some combination of these, or it may be something altogether unimagined. Even today, forensic advances have reopened the file slightly. Decades later, isotopic analysis of her teeth suggested she may have grown up in Central or Eastern Europe, possibly in the region of East Germany or Austria. This finding adds weight to the espionage theory, but it also muddies the waters further. If she was from there, why no family, no missing person reports, no whispers from neighbors who once knew her face? In the end, the theories surrounding the Isdal woman tell us less about her than they do about the anxieties of her era. In the Cold War, spies and shadows haunted every corner. In a rapidly modernizing Europe, rootless travelers and shifting identities became common. Her mystery became a mirror in which people saw their fears of secrecy, of betrayal, of the unknown moving silently among them. The Isdal woman may never reveal her truth, and perhaps that is why she endures. Mysteries with answers fade, mysteries without them live on, growing larger with each retelling. In most unsolved cases, there is a family pressing at the gates of authority, demanding answers. Mothers writing desperate letters, fathers retracing the last steps, children growing up with holes in their lives. But with the Isdal woman, there was none of that. No grieving relatives arrived at the morgue to claim her body. No one lit candles outside the police station. No tearful appeals were broadcast over the radio. Her absence was so complete, so carefully engineered, that it felt as though she had been erased from the human record long before her body was found. And yet, in the absence of family, a community of strangers took her into their collective memory. In Bergen, where her final days unfolded, people whispered about her for years. Shopkeepers remembered her strange purchases. The boots, the clothes, the cosmetics. Hotel clerks recalled her aloofness, her habit of signing names that always seemed to belong to someone else. Witnesses claimed to have seen her walking briskly through the streets, always alone, always looking over her shoulder. For the people of Bergen, she was a spectre who had brushed past their ordinary lives, then vanished into a forest fire of secrecy. Journalists, sensing the story's haunting appeal, took up the role that family might have played. Local newspapers carried the story in lurid detail: the burned body, the hidden suitcase, the coded notes. National outlets spread it further, turning the Isdal woman into a national riddle. Each article promised to peel back the mystery, but each left readers more unsettled. By the end of 1970, she had become less a victim and more a symbol, a human cipher that refused to yield her key. When the police buried her in February 1971, The ceremony was as stark as it was telling. No relatives stood by the grave. No mourners wept at her coffin. Instead, Norwegian police officers carried her casket, and local clergy conducted the rites. At the funeral, her coffin was adorned with flowers sent not by family but by sympathetic strangers who had read about her fate in the papers. It was a burial both dignified and lonely, an official effort to put to rest a body that no one claimed, while the mystery refused to lie still. But the story did not die. In fact, the Isdal woman grew larger in death than in life. Each decade added new layers of fascination. Amateur sleuths combed through old clippings, piecing together timelines and speculating about her coded notes. Radio programs revisited the case, fanning public imagination. Later, when technology advanced, forensic scientists returned to the evidence, conducting tests that had been impossible in the 1970s. The mystery lived on, not because of who she was to her family, but because of what she had become to everyone else. By the 1990s, the Isdal woman had become part of Bergen's identity. The Isdalen Valley itself gained a darker reputation, known less for its hiking trails and more for its ghost. Locals would tell hikers, that's where they found her, the woman with no name. She haunted the landscape like a legend, transforming geography into folklore. Her anonymity, once a tragedy, now lent her mythic status. And then, in the 2000s, the case found new life through the work of journalists and podcasters, who reopened the file. The Norwegian broadcaster NRK spearheaded one of the most thorough reinvestigations, using cutting-edge forensic methods to extract fresh clues from her remains. They tested her teeth with isotope analysis, tracing the signature of the minerals back to Central Europe. This breakthrough suggested she might have been from Germany, Austria, or even parts of France, narrowing the field of her possible origins. For the first time, investigators had a sense of where her life had begun, even if they still had no idea why it ended in fire on a mountainside. As these findings spread, the world reawakened to the Isdal woman. New generations of sleuths, armed with the internet and online forums, took up the mystery. They traded theories, compared notes and combed archives for missing links. To them, she was no longer just a Cold War ghost, but a puzzle that could still, perhaps, be solved. This digital obsession became a surrogate family, an ever-expanding group of strangers determined not to let her vanish into obscurity. For the people of Bergen, the case had long since entered the realm of folklore. Taxi drivers told passengers about the spy who died in the valley. Teachers mentioned the mystery to curious students. And hikers, pausing near the memorial stone in Isdalen, felt a shiver that had little to do with the mountain air. The woman with no name became part of the city's story, a thread in its cultural memory, an unquiet presence. Her grave, marked by a modest headstone, remains in Bergen. For decades it lay mostly unnoticed, visited only occasionally by journalists or the curious. But as the years passed and interest in her story revived, her resting place began to attract more visitors. People left flowers, candles, or small tokens, gestures of remembrance from strangers who felt compelled to give her the mourning she never received. In this way, the community of the living slowly adopted her, even though she had arrived among them as a stranger. There is a haunting paradox in all of this. The Isdal woman lived her life cloaked in secrecy, ensuring no one knew her name, her origin, or her story. Yet in death, she achieved a kind of immortality through communal obsession. She became more famous in her anonymity than she might ever have been with an identity. She had no family to fight for her, but she found one in the form of a curious public that refused to let her fade. The case, even 50 years later, remains a meeting ground between official failure and public persistence. Police could not or would not solve it. Governments turned away, but journalists, locals, scientists, and strangers across the globe picked up the file and carried it forward. Their search is less about closure and more about remembrance. They do not want her mystery to die, because in preserving it, they give her the family she never had. And so, the Isdal woman lives on, not in the warmth of kinship, but in the cold, persistent fascination of strangers. She is mourned not by blood relatives, but by generations of storytellers, investigators, and ordinary people who feel the pull of a riddle that refuses to be solved. In the end, her community is us, the readers, the listeners, the ones who cannot stop turning the page. The file is heavy now. Decades of speculation, hundreds of reports, thousands of words, all of it pressed into paper that feels like it should contain an answer. But it doesn't. The more pages you turn, the more you realize the Isdal woman's story isn't here. What we have are fragments, and fragments never make a whole. Her autopsy report, precise and clinical, cannot explain the why. Her coded notebooks, lined with numbers that never quite add up, cannot explain the who. The scattered hotel receipts, the wigs, the false passports, objects stripped of fingerprints and identities, cannot explain what brought her to Norway in the final weeks of her life. And so we sit here, surrounded by evidence that doesn't quite connect, staring at a puzzle where the missing pieces have been deliberately removed. She was someone, that is the only certainty. A woman who breathed, who spoke, who moved through the streets of Bergen in polished shoes and carried herself with the calm precision of a person who belonged everywhere and nowhere. Yet her life, as we know it, seems built to vanish. Every disguise, every alias, every half step into the shadows was part of a larger design, whether her own or someone else's. We may never know. Was she the architect of her own disappearance, living a life of deception until it consumed her? Or was she a pawn in a game larger than herself, discarded once she had outlived her usefulness? Each theory opens a door that leads to more corridors of smoke. Suicide, espionage, murder. The neat categories break down the more you study them. The autopsy showed pills in her stomach, but also smoke in her lungs. She was alive as the fire burned her. A watch with its serial number scratched off is found near her body, but who carries a watch with no traceable identity? Her luggage in the train station lockers contained wigs and false passports, but who takes such measures unless they expect to be followed? And then there are the witnesses, those who claimed to see her with a tall, dark-haired man, others who said she seemed nervous, and some who insisted she acted calm, even rehearsed. Which version is real? Which detail belongs to her truth, and which were planted to keep us from ever reaching it? Forensic science has tried to speak for her, where she could not. The isotopes in her teeth trace her childhood to Central Europe, perhaps Germany or France. Chemical analysis of her belongings suggests she traveled through Italy. Her handwriting hinted at education, refinement, a person used to observation and precision. All of these details sketch the outline of a life, but the center remains blank. She is a figure drawn in shadow, defined by the edges, erased at the core. Her grave in Bergen still waits for her story. The stone is plain, it marks her existence but not her identity. Over the years, flowers have appeared on it, sometimes from strangers, sometimes from locals who remember the case, sometimes from those who simply feel drawn to mysteries that will not close. In 2016, investigators exhumed her remains to extract DNA, hoping that modern science might return the one thing she had been denied: a name. The results placed her in Europe, but nothing more. It was another fragment, another corridor, another locked door without a key. What unsettles most about the Isdal woman is not just her death, but the silence that surrounds it. Silence from governments, silence from witnesses, silence from time itself. The Cold War was an age of secrets, and she may have been one of them. If she was a spy, she was erased as cleanly as her fingerprints. If she was a victim, then her killers succeeded in burying the truth alongside her. If she was something else entirely, then perhaps we were never meant to know her story. That is the haunting power of her case. Some mysteries are puzzles to be solved, others are mirrors we stare into, finding only our own need for answers reflected back. She has become more myth than woman now, an emblem of the unknowable, a whisper in the valley where she died. And like all myths, she resists resolution. Imagine her for a moment, as she might have been on her final night, walking alone down the streets of Bergen, her coat drawn tight, the November cold settling in. Perhaps she glanced behind her, watching for someone who might have been following. Perhaps she sat in a cafe, stirring her coffee too long, lost in thoughts she knew no one else would ever share. Perhaps she carried her disguises not as tools of trade, but as shields, masks she needed to survive. And perhaps she knew even then that survival would not be hers for much longer. We will never know. That is the weight this case leaves with us. She is out there in the files, in the autopsy reports, in the coded notebooks, but she is also out there in the silence, in the gaps, in the erasures, in the deliberate destruction of identity that ensures we cannot ever be certain. Some mysteries end with evidence, others end with the realization that evidence was never meant to endure. And so, the Isdal woman remains. She lies in her grave beneath the Bergen sky, a woman without a name, a life without a story, a puzzle without a solution. Decades later, she still leans over our shoulders as we turn these pages, her shadow flickering in the lamplight, her eyes unblinking, her silence unbroken. As we close the file tonight, we are left with nothing but that silence. It lingers in the air, thick and unresolved. She is there in it, haunting, unfinished. The Isdal woman does not rest, and neither do we.